Hi, 8th graders. This is the second part of the tides lecture. The first one was pretty a quick overview just about what tides are and how they happen. How they happen because the moon has a gravitational pull on the water on Earth, and it pulls it towards it, like in this picture right here. The water is actually being pulled towards the moon, and actually we have a high tide on both sides of the moon when this happens because the moon also is pulling the Earth a little bit over as well. And so we get a tidal bulge on both sides, okay? I wanted to talk today, get into a little bit more detail about what tidal range is, okay? So tidal range is the difference between the ocean level at high tide and the ocean level at low tide. Okay, it's just a vocabulary term. So in this figure here, it shows if you imagine yourself standing here on the beach, during the day, you would get 2 high tides and 2 low tides. So as you're standing here, let's say it's high tide right now, the water is as far up as it's going to get. Once it reaches its peak, it will gradually decrease and decrease and decrease and decrease and decrease until it gets to the minimum that it's going to be in that particular area. And then 6 hours later, actually it continues. It gets down to a minimum and then it starts to, it's kind of like it's breathing. It increases and increases and increases. And so what happens is that about 4 times a day, you get a peak and then you get a low 6 hours later, and then 6 hours later you get a peak, and 6 hours later you get a low again. And the difference between high tide and low tide in any given area is called its tidal range. There's a lot of different things that can come into play to determine if an area has a really big tidal range or a really small tidal range. One thing would be the slope of the ocean floor, right? If it is a very gradual slope going up into the beach, you're going to get a bigger tidal range, right? Because all of that water is going to has nowhere else to go but force its way up onto land. Okay? If it's got a very steep tide or a steep shoreline, that tidal range is not going to come in as far, inland as far, than it would if this were really gradually sloped. So it really depends kind of on the topography and also, again, what phase of the moon we have, okay? So again, neap tides, I said this in our last lecture, but neap tides are tides that have the smallest tidal range, and they occur when the moon, earth, and sun form a 90-degree angle. So right here, okay? Because in this position, it's just the moon's gravity that's acting on the water right here. When you've got the moon in the full moon position or in the new moon position, you've got 2 things at work here. You've got the moon and you've got the sun. And so during those phases, you're going to have a really great tidal range. All right, the water is going to, in one area, like let's go up here. If you're standing right here and it is the new moon, the water might come all the way up to your toes and then it might go all the way out to here. You know, and that happens twice a day. At a quarter moon, if you're standing here, maybe the high tide will only be this far and then it'll go out this far. Okay, so maybe the tidal range during a neap tide would only be a couple meters, and during a spring tide, during the new and the full moon phases, it could be, 10, 20 meters. All right. Let's see. I do have a couple, I did put this figure onto the Google Classroom yesterday, but I just wanted to show you one more time this part right here. Let me just zoom in. All right, so after having said what I just said about the tidal range, you can see on this top figure, this is just kind of a diagram that shows you that the tidal range, these subtraction lines here, the tidal range is decreasing. So when we have a new moon, the water is going to come way in, and it's also going to go way out to sea, okay? As we leave the new moon and we head through the crescent moon phases, okay, as that moon is moving from being lined up completely to a 90-degree angle, it's going to decrease in tidal range. So it'll come in a little bit less and it'll go out a little bit less until we get down to the first quarter where the water might not move very much at all. You might not even notice that there's a big tide there, okay? And then it increases in tidal range up until the full moon, and it decreases in tidal range to the third quarter. All right, so all of that has to do with where the moon is in relationship to the sun and the earth. One other thing that I wanted to talk about is tide pools. Tide pools are really cool areas along some coastal seas or some coastal cities. A few that I've been to were in Oregon and in Northern California. And so if you imagine the water moving over a beach, okay, it's going to bring with it a lot of live organisms, right? And then when the water flows out at low tide, you've got, if the shoreline has a lot of rocks and depressions and pools in it, you are going to get all of these areas that hold water like little tubs, and all of these live organisms that hang out or kind of get trapped there. And so in some areas, it's really cool to go to tidal pools. If you go to the tide pools early in the morning, right when the tide is going out, you can walk right up to these little areas and see sea life that you may not have been able to see at any other time, because they're kind of trapped in these little aquariums for you to have a nice close-up look. A lot of people will walk up and down the beach in areas that I've been that have tide pools. They'll walk up and down the beach and find live organisms and chuck them back out to the ocean. So they don't get too hot in those tidal pools, but it's a really neat thing. If you're ever on a coast, if you're ever on the ocean on either coast, pay attention to the tidal schedule. It doesn't happen every day. I mean, it happens every day, but it doesn't happen at the same time every day. So you need to know when the high tide is and when the low tide is. And you'll want to go out and check out the beach as the water is retreating. So after it gets to its maximum, its high tide, and the water starts to retreat, it's going to uncover a lot of things. So that's a time when a lot of people go out and pick shells that have been washed up and see some of these live critters. Alrighty, so that concludes our tide discussion. In class, we will be watching a part of Blue Planet Tidal Seas. I'll see if I can get a link for some of you distance learners to be able to see that as well. And I will talk to you soon.